For a while, you could get away with it. You could say, I'm going to avoid these hot topic issues and just help people follow Jesus because I don't want people to be turned off from Jesus because of abortion or because of race or because of one of these cultural topics. But now, the chickens have come home to roost, and we have a lot of Christians out there who, like Patrick already said, are more influenced by the cultural media landscape than they are the scriptures. So we've gone down this road, and we see the fruit it has borne, and now I think we're going to have to be a little bit more courageous. Now, let's be clear, we're not talking about being partisan and coming out on Team Red and Team Blue. I get that a lot of churches are doing that. Digital churches, online communities, more going the Team Blue route, and Team Red, you can see that some churches are just going all in on kind of what you might even think of as Christian nationalism or some modified version of it, and that's their church growth strategy. We're not talking about doing that. We're talking about bringing Jesus's politic, the kingdom of God, the Sermon on the Mount, to bear on the things that everybody's talking about. And so if everybody else is talking about these cultural topics, but Christians aren't, or the church isn't, then we've contributed to the problem that we're all now experiencing.
Hey, welcome along to today's program. If you're watching here on the YouTube channel, do make sure to like today's video, subscribe to the channel for more, and of course you can get more from the show by registering for our newsletter. The link is with today's info. You can even get a free ebook when you do that. Really excited to be joined on the show today by Patrick Miller and Keith Simon. Truth Over Tribe is the name of their new book, and they host a podcast of the same name as well. They're both church pastors in the US, and they wanted to address the increasing polarisation in politics, culture and Christianity that they've been witnessing in recent years. And of course, with Trump set to return to contest the presidency again in a couple of years' time, and the culture war still in full swing, this is an interesting moment to be hosting such a show and writing such a book. We're going to be asking how the church can be part of the solution rather than the problem of tribalism in the US and generally in the world, in global politics and more. So thank you very much, Patrick and Keith, for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Justin.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
Oh, it's great to meet you guys. Meet you over the internet, as we do so often these days. Tell us a bit about yourself. What made you? How did you meet? What got you into this particular project? Make you want to start a podcast and write a book? How did it all begin?
We're pastors at the same church, and we live inside of a blue city, but we live in a red state. And so we are dealing with a fractured society, and we are experiencing it even inside our church, a fracturing church. And we've kind of been wrestling with the kinds of questions that people have been asking over the last few years and noticed that they changed. Like earlier in our church's history, we planted the church 22 years ago in 2000. People would maybe decide if we're the right church for them based on doctrinal or theological issues. But all of a sudden we started realizing people were trying to decide if we were the right church on them because of our response to Black Lives Matter or President Trump or kind of what we might think of as cultural issues. And one day we were in the office just kind of processing what we were hearing and seeing, trying to figure it out. And we said, it's like Christians, we've got to put truth over tribes in our life. And all of a sudden we looked at each other and we thought, hey, maybe there's something there that we should pursue.
Yeah. And that's how we named everything, because we're not very creative. So we started a podcast and we ended up writing a book along the exact same lines. But like he said, this is coming out of church ministry. I think that the church should be a place where you expect to worship alongside people who don't agree with you politically, who might not agree with you in terms of your partisan or political ideology. And for a long time, like Keith said, we were able to accomplish that and do that as a church. But over the last 4 to 6 years, depending on where you want to start it, it has become increasingly difficult to lead churches that have political diversity. And why I think this is so important is because the church and the way we organize ourselves, it's supposed to be a witness to the world of who is king, of who reigns. And the world divides us based on our politics, based on our ideologies. But when Jesus is king, he tears down those dividing walls. He brings people together who the world says they should never be in the same room. They should never be in the same small group. They should never worship alongside one another. He brings them together, and it's a way of testifying to the powers of the world. You aren't in charge here. Jesus is. We do things differently. We have a unity that you cannot experience elsewhere.
I mean, that sounds great in theory, but as you say, churches can be just as prone to the kinds of divisions and cultural issues that any part of society is. So what were you seeing happening in these churches? What I suppose if you want to as well define tribalism and how you see it playing out, not only in churches but in culture and in politics, what have been kind of some of the key tribal areas that you've noticed developing in recent years?
Well, let me tell you a story about how it came on our radar, at least one of the ways it came on our radar, and then Patrick can give you the definitions. So this is not too long after George Floyd's murder, and kind of leading up to that week, we watched him be killed, and everybody in our country saw that on video, and we were traumatized by it. We didn't know the details. We didn't know how it would be played out and that the officer would be convicted, but we were traumatized by it. And that weekend, going into our Sunday service, we had planned to talk about it, lament that death. We felt like that was the right Christian response in honor of the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. But leading up to that service, we were getting hits, even that Sunday morning on our social media, saying, if you don't talk about this, I'm never coming back to the crossing. And that was kind of from what we would call Team Blue. And then Team Red, after the service, said, do you think all cops are bigots and hate black people? And that was Team Red. And we're like, no, of course not. We never said anything like that. And then, not too long after that, I got an email from a guy in our church who's a fantastic guy. And he said, I've noticed that some of our prayers have become more political. And I really didn't know what he meant. And I responded and said, well, kind of, can you help me with that? What do you mean? Can you give me an example? And he said, yeah, we're praying a lot these days about oppression and justice. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. So I now created what I call the Bible Gateway Challenge. I just sent him to Bible Gateway and I said, okay, put oppress and justice in the search bar and tell me what you found. And this is a really good guy who wanted to know the truth, wasn't trying to cause problems, so he actually did it. And he emailed me back quickly saying, wow, it's everywhere in the Bible. And these are the verses that meant the most to me that I found when I looked it up. And what had happened is that he had come to the worship service unintentionally with political lenses on, like he got from the cable news networks, right? Tucker Carlson or the New York Times, because every side does it. It's not just one group of people who are guilty of tribalism. It's everywhere. And he was listening to the prayers of the church through political lens, not realizing that the Bible says a lot about oppression and injustice. And those are things that Jesus cares about. So we said, hey, we've got to do something to address this. We've created, and by we mean our church, but we mean all kind of churches, that we've created a vacuum, and now we've allowed cable news to fill that vacuum, or we've allowed traditional media to fill that vacuum, and people are seeing the scriptures through the lens of their tribal politics.
Yeah, our concern is not so much that the church is political, because I think fundamentally the gospel is a political message, and we can get into that and what that means. The problem is that the church has become partisan. Jesus is political. He has a politic, but he's not partisan. He doesn't need to get a job in the Oval Office because he's got a way better throne in heaven. It's going to be a major downgrade for him. And so, like he said, we realize that if we didn't disciple people in their politic, how they thought about how we live together, how we organize our lives, how we define good and evil, justice and injustice. If we didn't disciple that, again, it was going to be the sermonizing of Tucker Carlson, or it was going to be the scriptural pages of the New York Times. Those were going to be the things that informed their views. And in a real sense, this is us kind of issuing a mea culpa. Maybe we didn't do a good enough job as a church of actually addressing the politic of the kingdom of God and the Sermon on the Mount.
I think a lot of pastors just duck the issue altogether, if I'm honest. I think it's such a hot button issue now, and they run such a danger of upsetting one side or another in their church that a lot of pastors just say, I'm not going to touch politics, full stop. Is that a mistake? Can you understand why they might be choosing that?
Hey, I'm sympathetic to him. I've thought the same thing and said the same thing. And I think for a while you could get away with it. You could say, I'm going to avoid these hot topic issues and just help people follow Jesus because I don't want people to be turned off from Jesus because of abortion or because of race or because of one of these cultural topics. But now, the chickens have come home to roost, and we have a lot of Christians out there who, like Patrick already said, are more influenced by the cultural media landscape than they are the scriptures. So we've gone down this road, and we see the fruit it has borne, and now I think we're going to have to be a little bit more courageous. Now, let's be clear. We're not talking about being partisan and coming out on Team Red and Team Blue. I get that a lot of churches are doing that. Digital churches, online communities, more going the Team Blue route, and Team Team Red, you can see that some churches are just going all in on kind of what you might even think of as Christian nationalism or some modified version of it. And that's their church growth strategy. We're not talking about doing that. We're talking about bringing Jesus's politic, the kingdom of God, the Sermon on the Mount, to bear on the things that everybody's talking about. And so if everybody else is talking about these cultural topics, but Christians aren't, or the church isn't, then we've contributed to the problem that we're all now experiencing.
How does 1 hour on a Sunday, though, compete with that 24/7 news cycle? Because that is what is actually pastoring most of our congregations most of the time, isn't it?
I think that is a immense problem that churches have to figure out how to redress. And on one level, I have tremendous hope, because this is not the first time that the church has faced partisanship or tribalism. You go back to the early church and you had Jews and Gentiles dividing over ethnic and racial and cultural issues at the time. So there's nothing new today about us dividing over political issues in this case, and sometimes over race and some other things. But to answer your question directly, churches have to get creative. We need to find ways to get into people's everyday lives the same way that cable news is. And that's part of, again, why we actually started a podcast. It's why we're very for what you're doing on this show and other Christians around the world. We're saying if we want to disciple Christians, we're going to have to take up some of their mind space that the cable news networks want to claim. And that's a beautiful, good thing that we should continue to encourage.
Tell me about tribalism. Why are we primed to be tribal? I guess the very word suggests that it goes a long way back to sort of, tribal days and so on. But in a way, however technologically savvy we are, it feels like we never quite lose that kind of in-group, out-group kind of mentality, do we? So do you want to talk about the psychology of that and how it's being weaponized almost these days?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. We have Stone Age minds and Space Age times. And it turns out that is a bad cocktail. No one wants to drink that one. But we are all in the midst of taking a sip, so there's nothing we can do. No, I think you're right. We are hardwired for tribalism. And there's been a tremendous amount of research on this topic. And if you wanted to, we could spend the next hour going through study after study exploring this. But I'll just share with you my first and favorite one. It was by a researcher at Leiden University named Karsten de Drew. And he was researching oxytocin, which is commonly called the love drug. So this is what's released in a mom's brain when she sees a baby for the first time. It's what's released in the baby's brain when the baby sees mom. It's what you feel when you see your beloved. And, it's what you're missing when the relationship starts to feel a little bit dry. And so Karsten de Drew had this wild idea. If oxytocin produces love, empathy, self-sacrifice, all of these wonderful things, maybe we could end tribalism by just pumping oxytocin into the water. And so he does a test to figure out if this is going to be the case. So he has one control. He has two groups of men. The control group, they don't get any oxytocin. The other group, they spray oxytocin into their nose, and then they observe them for the next day. And it's amazing. It actually turns out that the group that got the oxytocin, they were more self-sacrificial. They were kinder. They were more generous. They were more empathetic. The group cohered much better. But there was a catch. It also turned out that group was much more antagonistic towards outsiders. When given the opportunity to harm or to take from the other group, the group that got the oxytocin took those opportunities at a far higher rate than the group without the oxytocin. And so right there we see that the chemicals in our brain, we are hardwired to be tribalists. The beauty is the coherence, the empathy, the group, the belongingness, but the dark side, the side that I would say sin and the fall have kind of opened us up to, is this desire to conquer, this desire to win, this desire to defeat.
I wonder how is that kind of being expressed then today? Because I guess when I look at social media, it feels like to some extent it's set up as the ultimate form of engaging that kind of tribal Stone Age mind, isn't it?
Well, it is. Social media plays a big part in this because, as we all know by now, it is incentivized to appeal to your anger and your anxiety in order to keep you on their platform. And so creating and fostering, fomenting tribalism and fear is part of their business plan. It's literally they're kind of motivated by profit. And so what you see are people factionalizing, and there's a certain degree of self-righteousness that comes when we create us versus them. We are the good people, and they are the bad people. And it gives us a community to bond to. The more that relationships inside of community deteriorate, break down, the lonelier and more isolated people get, the more they're attracted to these online crowds that they can feel like give them some kind of voice. But like Patrick said, this has been going on a long time. I mean, you just go back into the pages of the scripture and you see Jews and Samaritans dealing with tribalism. So Jesus speaks directly to these very issues. He reached out and initiated conversations with the Samaritan woman at the well. He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And of course, the Jews were offended and shocked by this. When the disciples came up on Jesus talking to the woman, they said, look, this isn't what we do. We don't talk to these kind of people. They were offended by the parable of the Good Samaritan because in their mind, there were no Good Samaritans. So I think sometimes when people say, well, Jesus doesn't speak to these issues, they've kind of missed a major theme in the Bible from beginning to end, is that Jesus brings a unity that everybody wants and needs and craves, but can't be found outside of him.
So what's the difference between holding strongly to a set of beliefs, perhaps deeply held beliefs, and being tribal about those beliefs? Because presumably it's not wrong necessarily to hold something strongly, but where does it cross into sort of this tribalism, which is the negative side of that?
There's another thinker named Justin Giboney who talks about oppositional politics. So these are people who, if I'm on team A and you say something and you're on team B, I will take the exact opposite position no matter what, because you're not on my team, right? So I'm actually not thinking through my positions. I'm reacting to your positions and vice versa. So that's not holding an opinion strongly. That's a reactive opinion. It's an opinion that is defined simply by what someone who's in the out group believes. And so on the one hand, I think we just need to be a little bit honest about why we hold the views we hold. Look, when you think about knowledge, you can't possibly know everything. The brain accounts for about 2% of our body mass, and yet it also accounts for 20% of our metabolism. And so that means that thinking takes a lot of energy. You got to have a lot of calories to think hard. And so one way that humans have dealt with this is we have spread knowledge across human communities. I don't know how a toilet works. I use a toilet every day, but I couldn't tell you the first thing of how it evacuates my evacuations. I don't understand how it works. And that's a beautiful thing, because if I had to understand every detail of my life, know how everything worked, I wouldn't be able to function. We wouldn't be able to function as a society. Now, again, the hard part here is because we're hardwired to trust one another and inside of our groups, it makes it very difficult for us to disagree with the group. And I think that's maybe one of the most important things you could say is, hey, am I a tribalist or am I thinking? Am I holding my position strongly? Tribalists will never disagree with their groups. Tribalists will never have the courage to speak up and say, hey, I agree with you on a lot, but on this one thing, I have to press back. That's a great sign that maybe you've bought into a tribal form of thinking as opposed to honest thinking.
And I just would add, I agree completely, and just would add that when you're tribal, you demonize the other side. In other words, they're not just wrong about an issue, they're wicked. And what happens is that it's easy to form those opinions because we have kind of self-sorted ourselves by where we live or by what social media channels we're on or cable news networks we listen to. And so we don't really know people who hold to different beliefs. We only know about them. So I think of the story in Luke 9 when the James and John went to call down fire on the Samaritans. Well, first of all, can you just imagine what that must have been like, where they look at the Prince of Peace and say, hey, can we napalm this whole village? I'm just like, what are you thinking? Obviously, they didn't get it. They didn't understand why Jesus was going to Jerusalem. They thought he was going there to, defeat the Romans. Turns out he was going to die for the Romans, and not just die for the Romans, but die for the Samaritans. But think about this then. Jesus goes to the cross and he's resurrected, and he starts changing Samaritans' lives. Like, they start coming to faith. And so here James and John, probably I would guess, worshiping Jesus right alongside some of the same Samaritans that they had wanted to kill, that they'd wanted to die. And I think that's a picture of what Jesus can do. But let's go back. The reason they were so comfortable wanting to call down fire on these Samaritans, they didn't know them. And I think a lot of the reasons that we are tribal is because we don't know people on the other side. And so we've deemed them bad people. And once you get to know the people who hold different beliefs than you do, you realize that you might disagree with them. It's totally fine to disagree with them. But they're good people. You know, that Trump supporter that you can't stand is the one who volunteers at a homeless shelter. And that progressive that you think is ruining the world is the one that brought your family a meal when you had a baby. That we have a lot more in common than we maybe sometimes realize or think of at the moment.
So I mean, you talk about demonizing and that being a problem in the tribalism, but I'm always surprised by the intensity of the feeling that is there when I speak to my friends in the US on both sides of this. Just had someone over from the US recently who was doing some shows with me, and he wanted to be objective about the politics at the time the midterms were just happening, but he was pretty strong in saying, I just cannot understand as a Republican, as a Christian, how someone could vote for the Democrats, because ultimately a vote for the Democrats is a vote to basically murder babies. I mean, it's as strong as that. If that's your kind of bottom line, then you can understand why someone would say it's just a non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. And I will find it difficult to sit down with someone who could even countenance that. And likewise, on the other side, you might find someone who just thinks a vote for the Republicans is a vote for bigotry and injustice or whatever. So when the feelings are held that strongly about what it means to be on one side or the other, how do you find that common ground and even the opportunity to sit down together?
Well, I think it's really challenging, and that's one reason why we advocate for relativizing your partisan allegiances. Our goal is not that someone would read our book and listen to our podcast and leave behind their Republican identity or their Democratic identity. Instead, our hope would be that it gets relegated to a much lower importance. And why that really matters is because if it's lower, you're going to be willing to build relationships with people who are in the other tribe. I mean, let's just take that example. If you think that a Democrat, any Democratic vote, is voting to kill babies, I would argue that you haven't had many great conversations with Democrats, because I've never met a Democrat who literally said to me, I want to kill babies. Now, they might be for choice. They might have reasons for advocating for abortion, but actually it turns out there's a lot of Democrats who are pro-life. A fascinating example of this has been explored in the Black community. By and large, Black Christians are pro-life, and yet by and large they vote Democratic. Why? Well, it's because they have a different hierarchy of values. There's other things that they prioritize above abortion. And it might be because they say, look, I don't think a presidential candidate's going to actually make a major shift in our country on abortion, but they've got higher priorities, and that's what's driving their decision making. And so it goes back to Keith's earlier point. If you build a relationship and you don't feel like you have to argue with the person and ask them, hey, why do you hold this position? Help me understand why you voted for this person. I think you'll often be surprised by the reasons they give on both sides. It turns out that Republican maybe really isn't the bigot or the racist or the whateverist that you think he was. Turns out that progressive on the other side wasn't for killing babies the way that you thought they were. But you have to sit down and build a relationship and share some common humanity before you begin to see that.
I was going to say, a lot of people here in the UK were surprised on our side of the pond when Trump was elected. That was a surprise. But also surprised when Brexit happened as well here. That was kind of the big dividing issue in the same year for people in the UK. And the reason I think that people were surprised was because they had thought their side was absolutely going to walk it, because they were only talking and interacting with people who believed the same things as them. And I suspect the same was true of the Trump thing. Why it surprised so many people when he was elected is because they simply didn't know anyone who was going to vote for Trump. They thought that was like the really out there. So I can see why, there might be a benefit in actually getting people of different persuasions, political, cultural, religious, whatever, to start talking together. How have you guys kind of been trying to model that at the Crossing? Tell me about some of the practical ways in which you've tried to overcome some of this tribalism by getting people who are different together.
Can I go back for just 1 second? Because I like the point you were making about we don't know people who voted for the other candidate, and therefore we're shocked. We might even say their election was stolen because we can't even imagine how the other person won. The other candidate won because we didn't know anybody who voted like that. And this part of the self-sorting, I don't want to speak to the Brexit issue because I don't live in your country, and so I could be wrong on that. But in the United States, what we've seen is that people are moving to be around people who are like them. So So a landslide county is a county in which one candidate won by at least 20 percentage points. And if you go back into the early 80s, there were not many landslide counties. That blue and red were kind of mixed together. And the county would go for one or the other by a few points, but not by a lot. But over the last couple decades, what we've seen is that now 57% of Americans live in a county in which one candidate won by over 20 points. Now, that's a landslide, and that's where it gets its name. So you literally don't know people who voted for the other candidate, and so you're shocked when the other team won. And you don't know people who are different than you, so you build this story around how they're bad people. So that happens physically and geographically, but it also happens in other places in life, like we said, social media or cable news network. So I think that's really, really important. And I don't know how that's going to change, but it is affecting churches, because if you go to a church in Landslide County, probably you worship with people who all think like you do. And the more you're around people who all think like you do, the more self-righteous you become and more entrenched in your beliefs you become.
I tell you what, let's come to that question I asked then about how we overcome that in just a moment. We're going to go to a break first of all. Really great conversation here, though. Really enjoying this. Patrick Miller and Keith Simon joining me, Justin Briley on Unbelievable today. How can we make politics about truth, not tribes? Their book is called Truth Over Tribe. Really great read and a great podcast too. I'll make sure there's a link from today's show where you can listen and pick up a copy. But we'll be back with Patrick and Keith in just a moment's time. 2/3 of people believe that science and religion are incompatible, according to a recent UK survey. Many of the key atheist voices in our culture have used science as a battering ram against Christian belief. But there's a different story to be told about science and faith, and few people better to tell it than John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at the University of Oxford. I'm Justin Briley, and in this new online course from Premier Unbelievable on science, faith, and the evidence for God, you're invited to learn from one of the most celebrated Christian thinkers of our time as I open up the conversations I've hosted between John Lennox and atheist thinker Michael Roos and secular talk show host Dave Rubin. Across 9 modules, you'll discover how Christianity grounds the evidence for God, why it led to the rise of modern science, what response we can give to the question of evil, whether miracles are anti-scientific, and why atheism and science can't account for human value or the biggest questions our culture is asking. As well as my guide to these top-flight conversations, the course includes supplementary video material from lectures delivered by John Lennox on God, faith and science, along with questions and assignments to help you ground the various learning points in each module. You can take the course at your own speed and in your own time. Enroll now at the link with this video and learn how to make sense of science, Christianity and secular culture. Welcome back to today's show. We're talking about truth, tribe, politics, culture. My guests today are Patrick Miller and Keith Simon. They've got a great new book out, Truth Over Tribe, pledging allegiance to the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. You guys, it's interesting actually, in the US, red is Republican, is more right-wing, blue is Democrat, is more left-wing. It's the other way around in the UK. The Conservative Party is coloured blue. That's the more right-wing party.
I have for a long time thought that's the way it should be. Because you think about
Really?
it, blue is a cool color, conserving. Red is a hot color, boiling, I don't know. I always get them mixed up. I would rather live in the UK for that reason alone.
We're more logical when it comes to the coloration of our political divide. Well, that's one thing we've got over you guys. We don't actually have, I think, any animals associated with our particular political tribes, though, as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. But do you, just as a matter of trivia, as someone who doesn't know much about US politics, why a donkey and why an elephant? Is there any particular reason?
I could Wikipedia that, but right now I'm going to say I actually don't know. I've never been asked that question, nor have I been curious about it. I've taken it as a natural given.
Okay.
No idea, Justin. It was a good question.
All right. One for us all to go and look up later on. Anyway, I wanted to come back to the question we were at, which was, we've outlined the problem, and you do a great job in the book of that, but you also have some suggested solutions to this. I'd be fascinated to hear about your own experience as two pastors at the Crossing, about ways in which you practically tried to try and counter tribalism and do things that did actually bring different people together. Do you want to just give one or two examples of things that you tried that worked, that maybe didn't work? Tell us.
Yeah, one of the most important questions you can ask is, how do you respond when tribalists come for you? When the partisan mob has your head in their crosshairs, how do you react? And the good news is Jesus gave us incredible advice. He taught us how to forgive those who have harmed us, to love those who persecute us, and to pray for them. And so we're not coming ill-equipped. So this was back in 2019. We were going through the book of Genesis in a sermon series, and we got to the part where it talks about God making humanity in his image, male and female. And we preached a sermon that taught that, look, the Bible teaches there is a gender binary. There are only two genders, male and female. Now, the heart of the message was we need to love and embrace our trans community. We need to bring them into our church. It was not a message of hate, but as you can imagine, it caused a lot of a big stir in town, and local newspapers were writing things about us. But perhaps most importantly, we had a relationship with a documentary film festival in town, and it's one of the largest documentary film festivals in the country. And we built this relationship over 10 years. It was so unusual because we're an evangelical church working with this progressive film festival that the New York Times and Christianity Today, they wrote stories about it because it was just so bizarre. But there was a real mutuality between us. People from our church, they attended the festival, they volunteered at the festival. Some of them became staff members at the festival. And of course, the other way around, people from the festival checked out our church and began to know Jesus and worship him. And so it was a really strange but beautiful relationship. But when we preached this sermon and in kind of our current cultural context, it caused a lot of people to speak up and say that the film festival needed to break their partnership with us. And after quite a bit of pressure, they did exactly that. And they wrote a public letter. It wasn't the most condemning letter, but it wasn't the nicest letter either, about our church and about our views and why they can no longer partner with a church like us, despite having worked together for 10 years. And so, of course, when that happens, we were faced with a question. Do we respond in kind? Do we go to the newspapers and say, hey, these guys knew our views all along, they're trying to trick you? Or do we go in there and we say, hey, and attack back, fire back? Do we tell our church, don't you dare go to that festival? We're going to boycott the festival. Don't volunteer there. We're now against them.
It's kind of doing a cancel culture on cancel culture kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a cancel to the cancel. And of course, if I'm being honest, that was a painful experience. I mean, those were real friendships that were harmed and hurt, and the words they said were hard to read. And yet, even though there was part of me that wanted to respond that way, to attack back, I knew what Jesus had called us to do. And so myself, other pastors, people in our church, we took to social media, and we just wrote long posts saying how much we loved that film festival, encouraging people to please keep going, please keep volunteering, exploring why it's so important for our community, for our businesses, because they bring so many people into town. And about 2 weeks later, I was sitting down over lunch with the festival director, just debriefing on what had taken place. And he looked at me and he goes, I got to be honest with you. I don't know how you guys did that. That was a masterclass on grace. And I wanted to say to him, it's because we're awesome and we figured it all out. But I looked at him and I go, on one level, my gut didn't want to go this direction, but we've been taught by the master. We have a king who died for us while we were still his enemies. He loved us when we were trying to attack him and cancel him. And so we merely showed you what he showed us. And that's how we learned to do it. And so I think there are so many churches out there that want to be in the culture war, fighting against whether it's progressives or conservatives, whichever side you're on. And they think that's what Jesus has told us to do, to get out our axes, to sharpen them, to cut down the idols. And I find that to be exactly upside down. Jesus died for his enemies. And so one way we build bridges and end tribalism is by responding to tribalism with love and kindness.
So Patrick shares a story about how we handled being attacked. Here's a positive story of what we did to try to build bridges. Each Christmas and Easter, we try to do a giving campaign that helps people outside of our church. And we noticed that there were so many people who were suffering from medical debt in our community. And they were declaring bankruptcy, losing their homes, all because of crushing medical debt. So we partnered with a group out of New York called RIP, or Rest in Peace Medical Debt. And they are able to buy medical debt on pennies on the dollar. And so we said to our church, we said, hey, if we can raise, I forget exactly what it was, maybe like $20,000, something like that, we can pay off all the medical debt in our county. And the church responded in a crazy way. We raised $465,000 in 10 days, ended up paying off millions of dollars of medical debt in over 38 counties throughout our state. And when we were able to send a letter to people with RIP, our partner, and say your medical debt was canceled, we were able to say, Jesus canceled our debt, and we want to share the joy of helping you cancel your debt. And we didn't ask if they were Republicans or Democrats. We didn't ask if they were gay or straight, or men or women, or black or white, or whatever race they're a part of. All we said is who has a need, and then we want to help people with that need. Because it turns out that when Jesus came for us, he didn't ask if we voted Republican or Democrat, or what our sexual preferences are, or whatever. He just said who has a need, and we had a need, and Jesus came and he met that need. And I think when we can show our church that we can serve and love our community like Christ did, without putting up walls and without putting up an us versus them, that we're part of Jesus's tribe, and we invite everybody to come and follow Jesus along with us. Everyone is welcome.
Yeah, generosity without boundaries tears down boundary walls. And that's what we saw time and time again. People coming to our church and saying, I don't know why you did this. And I would have never stepped inside of a church. I would have never even thought about Jesus. But I'm willing to do it because you went across the boundary. You built a bridge that wasn't there. And now I want to come across and see what's on the other side.
Yeah, two great stories. And I remember when that story you mentioned there, Keith, came out, I just thought it was such an amazing creative way of doing something like that for your community. It was a wonderful story. I mean, coming back to the one you shared, Patrick, which was this issue that emerged when the preaching you'd done on the nature of gender and so on came out and caused this rift with the Progressive Film Festival. I mean, what occurs to me there is that even you had obviously had a good relationship with this. But there were obviously certain people, once they got hold of that, who felt this was a non-negotiable. That whatever good rapport you'd established with them kind of was shoved aside because at some kind of political or media level, it was felt, no, we can no longer be seen to be partnering with a church that holds those particular views, however they express them. And I think that's the issue we often bump up against, isn't it? In my experience, is that certain things have become sort of non-negotiable for some people. If you disagree with us on this, then we can't be friends. There can be no debate on it. This is not something that's up for discussion. Such that issues around, for instance, sexuality and gender have been put on a par now with, say, issues around race, so that it's almost like saying, well, we don't believe in interracial marriage in our church. And now that might be an issue that would stop a lot of people wanting to partner with you, say. But now people are regarding transgender and sexuality in a similar kind of way as almost immutable in that sense, and therefore non-negotiable. What do you do when the culture has shifted in that kind of way, and the things that maybe there was a willingness to understand that there were differences of opinion? It's like people can't be allowed to disagree on those things for some people anymore.
Well, I think there's a lot of responses. Unfortunately, in America, there is a long history of Christians believing that they should take and have and hold power. This is kind of the let's take back America for God approach. And so their response to this is, well, no, I disagree with the Progressive Film Festival. And in fact, I want to enact my views in policy, in legislation across the board because we should be in charge because this is a Christian nation after all. So that's one response. Our response has been more to say, you know what? Christians are to see themselves as exiles living in Babylon. America is not Israel. America is not Jerusalem. America is not the church. In fact, Peter, when he's talking to the church, he calls the church a holy nation. that means that our job isn't to set up another holy nation out there. We're already part of one. And in fact, our holy nation is transnational. Our holy nation exists across the world in many nations. And so that means that we aren't living in some special nation in America, which is a common misconception. No, we're exiles living in Babylon. And when you're an exile living in Babylon, you always have to be somewhat tentative about what you expect in the world. I don't expect the world around me to agree with my theology, to agree with all of my ethics. Now, I want the common good, and so I will work for the common good. I will try to argue persuasively for it. But at the end of the day, it's not my job to change my country. At the end of the day, my job is to be faithful to Jesus, to do my job with excellence, to do my job with character, and hope that God puts us in positions of influence where we can do good. But if he doesn't, then we're just like Daniel. We won't pray to the idols, and that might mean we get thrown to the lion's den. And what happens after that is up to God. And that's an uncomfortable place to be. And yeah, what we saw and what we've seen throughout church history is that the church has changed the world most, not when it took the reins of power, but when it laid down its life. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Rome was transformed by Christians who willingly laid down their lives, not just for their own, but for others. And so I think there's a real beauty to living in this moment. I know that sounds bizarre and strange, but I'm kind of happy to live in a place that doesn't see me as an insider. I'm happy to live in a place where I can be an outsider because it gives me the opportunity to show radical, sacrificial love to my neighbor.
And what do you do with Christians, though, who just take a very different view and who are pushing for something a bit more like Christian nationalism, who's saying, no, we do need to take the reins back. There is a biblical imperative for society and culture to be put back on the right track. And there's nothing wrong with using the means at our disposal if we can get into office, if we can, force change. I mean, essentially, a lot of Christians, and I don't know what your view is, but they celebrated when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And it was because, essentially, Trump had been put in power, arguably, by a lot of white evangelicals, and because he appointed more conservative judges to the Supreme Court. So is that wrong? Is that a bad use of how, Christians essentially using the tools of power and politics to influence culture in that kind of a way? Is there anything wrong necessarily with getting results in that kind of way?
Well, I think it comes down to a lot of nuance here, and we got to be careful because I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, I would encourage Christians to take their biblical convictions, their conscience, into the voting booth with them and to vote accordingly. Everybody brings their worldview and their beliefs into the voting booth with them, and Christians are no exception to that. And I think it's fine to go in and vote for the candidate that you think is going to bring about human flourishing. And if you're a Christian, then you're going to vote for the candidate whose values most reflect the scriptures. So I don't want to say that's Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is a wedding or a conflation of Christianity and government power, so that you want the government to institute by law a Christian worldview, and you want the government to give a special place to Christianity in the public square. I don't expect the government to institute the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God only comes with King Jesus. It doesn't come with the next president that is elected. So let's go to the abortion question for a second, because I think it's really interesting, and we're in a preliminary stage in this, so anything I say might be proven wrong down the road. But what you have is that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, and I personally think that is good. I agree with even the people on the left, the legal scholars, who said it was bad law. Even people on pro-choice said it's not a good precedent. I'm also glad because I'm very much pro-life and want more and more babies to be born and not aborted. But what you're finding now is in America is that there is a backlash against the pro-life movement. And you have to ask, where did this come from? Why did most polls show that America was pretty evenly divided, but now not so much? The pro-choice people seem to have the upper hand when it comes to elections. And here's what my guess is that the pro-life movement has been wedded to former President Trump and has been compromised, because in a quest to get judges, we have exchanged short-term gain for long-term loss, and that the pro-life movement has been compromised in character and integrity, because here's what you got to come down to. You've got to win people's hearts. Yeah, you have to win at the court and you have to win in legislatures. I get it. But ultimately, you also have to be morally persuasive. And when you jump in bed with someone who is whatever candidate now and whatever elective office, with someone who is morally compromised, your movement is going to be compromised. So that's my guess. That's my hypothesis of why conservative states are facing a backlash against the pro-life movement. I mean, Patrick and I haven't talked about this a lot. You might have a different take.
No, I think this is really worth exploring. Roe versus Wade being overturned, most people estimate reduced abortions by about 13% in the United States. Now, I celebrate that. I think that's wonderful news, but it was not a massive change in abortions in the United States. The reason being that it was already rather difficult to get abortions in states that immediately after Roe versus Wade was overturned enacted laws to end abortion in their states. Now, that means that we're in a state of a legislative battle, and that legislative battle, again, like he said, we have to persuade people. We have to win people to the pro-life position. And as it turns out, arguing that we're a Christian nation and we deserve the power and having very extreme laws, even if I agree, by the way, with those extreme laws, that's not a persuasive argument. And that gets to the heart of this. You have some Christians who in politics think that we should be inoffensive. Their primary goal is to offend no one, to say nothing offensive at all. We wouldn't agree with that because Jesus has a politic. I'm glad that Martin Luther King was offensive. That was good news, and that was good political action. And yet you have other people who believe that all we should do is be resolute. Just say the truth, just speak the truth. Neither of these groups are interested in persuading anyone. One group isn't interested because they don't want to offend anyone. The other group isn't interested because they don't feel the need to persuade. We're Christians, we should be in power, give us the power, end of statement. I want all three at once. I want to be someone who can persuade, someone who can be resolute, and someone who can show affection towards my enemies. And it's only when you get that whole package wrapped up together that I think you actually have the chance of slowly, over time, transforming society through influence.
What about those who are almost explicitly coming out now, though, for Christian nationalism? There's been this recent book published that's making quite a bit of headlines. I think it's called The Case for Christian Nationalism. I think Stephen Wolfe is the author. Maybe we'll get him on in the future. Who knows? But there seems to be almost, people are actually in the same way that, gay people took on that mantle of gay as a kind of, what was a slur is now being used to kind of define them. I almost feel like Christian nationalism is now sort of being rehabilitated almost by people who say, well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with, using the tools of politics and power to actually get biblical worldview out there? And are you seeing that movement grow? Do you have major concerns about that kind of direction?
If you want a fun Friday night, just follow Patrick on Twitter and watch him argue with the Christian nationalists. I'll let him jump in 1 second. But first, Justin, I think you're right. People are fighting over the term now. There's an argument over what does Christian nationalism mean. I saw a tweet this morning of a woman who I would consider a Christian nationalist, and she said this. She had a picture of a Fiji rugby team singing psalms before one of their games. And she said, if this is Christian nationalism, then count me in. Well, no one thinks that's Christian nationalism, but it's trying to redefine the term to make it about someone who just loves their country and loves Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's not what Christian nationalism is. Christian nationalism is about trying to force your views through the power of the government. And by defining the church in ethnic terms, it's bad for both our nation and it's especially bad for the church.
Yeah, there's an interesting horseshoe effect happening right now in America. If you ask someone on the progressive left what a Christian nationalist is, they would say, oh, this is a Christian who wants to bring their views into the public square and their Christian views into the public square and enact them in law. That's not actually Christian nationalism. That's pluralism. Those are two very different things. And ironically, though, this is exactly what I call this Christian nationalism light. This is what you're seeing happen on the right as well. They're saying, hey, if you think that nations are good things and you think that Christianity is a good thing, what's the problem of mixing our Christian and our nation? Look, I just want to bring my Christianity to bear on my nation. Now, again, those are not Christian nationalism. No one has ever historically understood those things to be Christian nationalism. That's a form of pluralism. What Christian nationalism is the tight merger of religious, national, and cultural, and typically ethnic identity into a whole. And people who hold this view, they think sociologically you can't pull those things apart, right? You can't take one piece out from another piece. They all come collectively together. And so the idea is if we want to live in a civil society, we need to share a lot in common. And again, remember, we talked about tribalism earlier. We need to cohere along those specific lines. Now, the problem is, at least in a country the size of the United States, is that we have very little coherence. We don't share a religion. We don't share ethnic backgrounds. We don't share cultures. I mean, you could just go from to a rural farm town and then move into a big city, and you would see wildly different cultures, to say nothing of if you went from Chinatown to a different part of a city that was maybe majority white and suburban, right? You're going to see all these cultural differences. And so that's where that's robust Christian nationalism, is the idea that we should divide based on these ethnic people groups where we have cultural homogeneity. And this is the opposite of Christianity. That's where we get into real trouble, is there's nothing Christian about dividing over people groups and ethnicity. The church is actually called to be a place where people from across the ethnic divide come together to worship Jesus. And so whatever that nation is, even if all the people who are ruling it and controlling it are Christian, it's fundamentally not Christian, because they've absolved themselves of a deeply Christian responsibility to build bridges across ethnic divides.
I mean, historically, it seems like the US setup has been a good place for that kind of thing to thrive, for people to be able to hold their different views, to be able to come together freely and associate and so on. Why does it feel like it's breaking down a bit at the moment? Why is it kind of not perhaps quite what the founding fathers envisaged at this point?
Well, part of me wants to say there's actually nothing new here. If you go back to the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, that was a vitriolic election. I mean, it makes our political ads today look very, very tame. You know, one guy is saying, if you vote for this guy, there's going to be prostitutes in the street. No one's going to believe in God. The other one's saying he's going to start a war with France. I mean, they said awful things about one another. And so there's nothing new in America about polarization. There's nothing new in America about populism, what we're seeing with Donald Trump. I mean, just go back to Andrew Jackson. A lot of these streams, I mean, you can go upstream and find them. I think what maybe makes this moment unique is what we talked about earlier. It's the ability of social media and digital technology to flatten the world. It's our ability to kind of cut across what happens locally and see what's happening in Washington and focus all of our attention on kind of the federal horse race, and to begin to think that that's where politics exists, when the reality is most people have no ability to affect what happens in Washington. They have a profound ability to affect what's happening at their home on a local level, but they've lost that because their attention is all in the wrong place. And so again, I think this is one of those results of the Stone Age mind and Space Age times.
I mean, just as we start to round this off, are you seeing a lot of fallout from the last several years? Because I do hear on my show from a lot of very jaded either Christians or ex-Christians or deconstructed Christians, and a lot of it seems to be not just that they maybe have intellectual objections to Christianity, but they've been turned off Christianity by a certain kind of politicized culture in the US. How much are you noticing that? Has this whole tribalism thing been ultimately quite damaging for the church?
It absolutely has. And I'm sympathetic to all those people. I feel the same thing. I'm a pastor of a church. I didn't become, well, neither Patrick nor I became Christians until we were in college. And so we didn't grow up in a Christian environment. I didn't like church. I didn't want to go to a church. I never wanted to be a pastor of a church. And here, this is what I'm spending my life doing. So if you're suspicious of church, well, I'm totally in that with you. And when you look at the political fallout for the last several years, you can't help but notice that the people who said character mattered under Bill Clinton threw out character when it came to Donald Trump. You've got to be consistent. And people who said that Clinton should resign because he was setting a horrible example for our children are now jumping in bed and saying, well, I'm not really electing a pastor. I'm looking for a president, and I want the toughest SOB I can find. Well, it appears that all you care about is power and that you're willing to do whatever you can to gain power. And so I think everybody is a bit suspicious of that. And then you add in some of the scandals in the church and podcasts that have followed, been devoted to those scandals, and you can't help but sympathize with people who are a bit suspicious of it. To tell you the truth, I think the deconstruction happens on that side, on the left, people who are disappointed with the power of the church, but I also think it happens on the right. I think that's what Christian nationalism is, in a sense, are people who are deconstructing on the right side, because what you find is that a lot of Christian nationalists, they don't go to church. They consider themselves Christians, but not church-going people who are really following Jesus. And that's interesting, isn't it? So they're claiming a national identity around faith, but it's not a personal faith that is affecting their life, and they're not devoted to Jesus. So you see the deconstruction happening on both sides.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit like the story of the lost sons. There are two lost sons, and one but whether you're the prodigal or the one who stays home, you can both be lost to God in that way. And it feels a bit like that, doesn't it, with however people are being turned off. This has been a fascinating conversation. Just as we do close now, we're recording this just before Thanksgiving, though it'll air more in the run up to Christmas. But both occasions are times when sometimes people sit down at a table who don't share views in common. It can be one of the most difficult meals to share, in fact, in some situations. And again, I often get listeners write in or tell me that how do I have these conversations? And you guys have been having these kinds of conversations. So any kind of just really practical tips for people who, are going to sit down with someone who thinks very differently to them, and they just want to make sure that this is a fruitful time rather than a tribalistic time. Any suggestions?
I would say 2 words: curiosity and humility. I find that if I'm curious about people, I will learn things. I might vehemently disagree with you about your perspective, but if I learn how to ask you questions, I will probably come to understand at least something about you, but probably something about the topic, again, that I didn't previously understand. And the other half is humility, realizing that we often are more certain about what we know than we should be. And so if you're across the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table from someone who disagrees with you, there's a good chance that you might actually have something wrong. And so why don't you take this as an opportunity to learn? But the other reason why I say that is I find that modeling the behavior that you would like in return is usually the best way to get it. Look, just because you're curious and humble and ask questions doesn't mean that, Uncle Joe is going to ask you questions. He might not, okay? But I think you've got a higher chance of him reaching out and hearing your views if you've given him the respect and honor of asking him for his perspective first.
I agree with Patrick. Asking questions is the way to go. Maybe, though, your dinner table, your Thanksgiving table is going to be so sensitive that it's just best to avoid it. Somewhere along the line, somebody convinced us that politics is more important than family, more important than friendship. That's insane. That is crazy town. Your family and your friendships are far more important than your politics. Now, I would love for you to be able to engage and learn and grow together and have interesting conversations. And again, the way you do that is by asking questions. It's not a time to lecture, it's a time to listen. But if you can't go there, then don't. We don't need another family divided over Donald Trump or over LGBTQ issues. Your family is more important than Washington, D.C. Don't fall for the lie that it's not.
It's been really helpful, very practical as well. And if you want more similar nature conversations, you guys obviously have the podcast. You've got lots of conversations between you both and with your guests. And perhaps I'll be able to come on and share some of my experience hosting these kinds of conversations from Unbelievable. But it's been lovely to link up with you guys for today's show. And thank you again for the book. It's called Truth Over Tribe, Pledging Allegiance to the Lamb, Not the Donkey or the Elephant. It's published by David Cook. And there is a link from today's show. ChooseTruthOverTribe.com is the website for all of those. But it's been wonderful to catch up with you, Patrick and Keith.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Justin.
Fantastic.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.